Welcome to the 2022 National Arab American Heritage Month webinar, hosted by the University of Houston Staff Council Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and the Arab American Education Foundation Center for Arab Studies. I'm Amber Rangel, the co-chair of the Staff Council Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, also dubbed as DEI. Today, I have here with me my co-chair, Debbie Samuels, who will wave on camera. The Staff Council DEI Committee is responsible for promoting diverse, equitable, and inclusive initiatives for staff and the UH community at large. The Staff Council DEI Committee and the Center for Arab Studies dates back to 2021 during our first event around Arab American History Month. This is our second workplace conversation we are producing together, and we look forward to collaborating in the future to engage in educational opportunities and discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. If you haven't already, please follow us on social media at UH Staff Council for upcoming events. Now introducing the moderator for today's event, Dr. Abdelrazak Takriti. Dr. Takriti is the founding director for the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies and is the inaugural holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Arab History at the University of Houston. He is the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author with Professor Karma Nabulsi of the Digital Humanities Project in the Palestinian Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Takriti.
Thank you very much, Amber. And it's a great honor to be hosting this event with the UH Staff Council. And we hope that this collaboration will go on for a very, very long time because it's very exciting that we get to mark the occasion of the National Arab American History Heritage Month. And I should note that UH is the first large Texas university to be adopting this initiative and to be marking this important occasion. And that shows the commitment to diversity and inclusion that exists on our campus. Hopefully, more campuses will follow suit in our state and join a growing national trend that is very exciting. Last year, we opened this series with a talk with a panel on the struggle against racism and Arab American communities. And the panel focused on movements dealing with different forms of racialization that Arab Americans are subjected to and the specificity of experiences that they encounter, as well as the interconnections with broader struggles and communities that are also face adversity and racism in the United States. Today, we decided for this year to also focus on a topic that relates to the grassroots, but we wanted to focus on a very important component of our community, which is the women's movement. The women's movement, as we will hear today, played a key role in developing grassroots organizing in Arab American circles and in empowering our communities. And I'm very honored to be introducing our speakers who will be talking about this movement from both an academic angle as well as lived experience as organizers. First, we're going to be starting with a wonderful and very powerful academic voice that is also not far from the grassroots and that is committed to community engagement on campus, and that is Professor Nadine Naber. She is a professor of gender and women's studies and global Asian studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. At UIC, she is the co-principal investigator of the Diaspora Cluster. She is a member of the executive committee of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, as well as the steering committee on the Social Justice Initiative. Her research interests lie at the intersections of transnational feminisms, women of color, and queer of color theory, as well as decolonizing feminisms, empire studies, critical race studies, and Middle East studies, as well as Arab American studies. So really broad-ranging research agenda and very powerful writings that include Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics, and Activism, which was published by NYU Press in 2012. Professor Naber is also the co-editor of Race and Arab Americans, which was published by Syracuse University Press in 2008. She also co-edited the Arab and Arab American Feminisms, which won the Arab American Book Award in 2012. And the list really goes on. It includes books like The Color of Violence. Her current book project, Ending Violence, is a transnational feminist ethnography focusing on feminist and queer activism in Beirut, Cairo, Chicago, and Detroit, and the ways gendered and sexualized state violence in the Arab homelands and diasporas magnify one another and take place within a similar spatial, temporal, imperial context. Now, Nadine is also a good friend, and she has graced us with visits to the UH campus twice. So we're very honored to welcome her again. And Nadine, the floor is yours.
Well, the honor is truly mine, especially to be, sharing in the amazing work at the University of Houston with Professor Takriti and all of the colleagues there, and the DEI work happening, and the support of all the administrators in this amazing Arab Center that we hope to model here in Chicago. So we are following your lead over here. I'm just getting my PowerPoint ready for you. Let's see. Okay, so I am going to speak about some histories of Arab American feminist activisms. The histories that I'll be sharing of indeed are not the history or the histories. They are the histories that I have studied as well as participated in as a scholar activist. So I'll just, for the purpose of time, I organized my thoughts around three themes that I think have been crucial to these histories that I'm kind of beginning in the 60s and 70s, but I'll focus more on the 1990s and beyond. So I'm organizing my thoughts around three themes: anti-imperialist feminisms, decolonizing culture, and coalitional joint struggle. And I'm also just so honored to be in the company of Maddie and Jehan and Zeina, my co-conspirators, who I am so inspired by and always learn from in terms of their analyses. So all of our work, I think, is connected and overlaps. So as I talk about anti-imperialist feminisms, I wanted to uplift that this trend is sort of born as a response to US-led empire building in our region and Zionism and US support for Zionism. And there are several periods that I quickly put together around the consolidation of Israeli settler colonialism in the 60s and 70s, and the movements in the United States, Palestinian liberation movements around the first and second intifadas, and also the US war on Iraq, September 11th, then the Arab Spring, the Trump era, and the endless war on terror that we're still witnessing today. So that's kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit about this briefly, this framing of anti-imperialist feminist activism and what it looks like and what it means. So basically what I mean by anti-imperialist feminist activism is an argument that is difficult to repeat because we've been repeating it for decades and decades and decades. And it's basically, the idea that US-led war depends on and uses and manipulates the bodies and lives and experiences of Arab and Muslim women to justify colonization, war, and Zionism. And I'm not even going to repeat it because I feel like we've heard it so many times before. But generally, the idea that US wars are justified by recycled arguments about Islamic sexual savagery. That's just one, way that argument looks. And Arab American feminists have been repeating our, recycled responses to this for at least 30 years now. And we continue to affirm louder than ever before the foundational arguments of Arab American feminist critique in this area, despite how sick and tired many of us might be of the same old argument. We still insist that it's, essential to continue raising our voices around resisting the racist arguments that use our bodies to justify genocide, displacement, and the confiscation of our lands and resources. And so I'll just also add, and so I'm being kind of brief, and I'd be happy to talk more in the question answer, that queer activists have, and I think I don't want to take away from any of the other speakers, have challenged anti-imperialist Arab feminist activism for relying on a gender binary. Because historically, we used to say, anti-Arab racism affects women through these portrayals that, Arab and Muslim women are the most oppressed women in the world, and then men are, racialized as terrorists and violent and, misogynist. And then the question came up around, that we're reifying the gender binary. And we have writings by people like Huda Jadallah in the book Arab American Feminisms, where she argues that, that she is targeted because people in a woman's bathroom perceive her through the racist idea of the Arab man terrorist or potential racist. So I think that's just important to uplift as a critique that challenged us and that we have had to contend with and, change and move our arguments in ways that are more accountable to queer and trans activists and comrades. So I'll just say a couple more about this, which is during the Trump era, we even saw this argument not only about justifying war abroad, but also in justifying the Muslim ban or immigration bans or immigration control against our people. And that was around, a lot of us haven't talked enough about how part of the Muslim ban included this idea that the US should not admit, people who engage in honor killings. And so again, we saw this, here's Trump, right? Protecting American borders through a feminist discourse. Right. So this idea of protecting American women from foreign nationals is very much what Israel does around portraying Israel as a safe haven for women's rights or queer justice, compared to Arab Muslim societies that are based in, sexual savagery and women's oppression. And so moving from there, I wanted to also just uplift how another part of Arab American feminist activism is to take seriously that this isn't just about discourses that justify war. I mean, indeed, we have argued that if you want to end war, we need to dismantle these discourses because they're essential. But at the same time, we have taken seriously how these discourses trickle down into our people's everyday lives, at school, in relation to law enforcement, in the hospitals, in the medical industry, every part of Arab American life, you see these same arguments trickling down in bullying at schools, and, in like I said, every area where, women, for example, are targeted either as, if you're wearing the hijab, you're a supporter of Osama bin Laden, or, even on our campus, people have experienced things like someone walking by saying, do you have a bomb under there, under your hijab? And we've had law enforcement pulling women over and, asking if they have bombs under their hijab. And so, of course, it's, affirming that especially women who wear hijab have been disproportionately targeted by gendered racism. Now, what I want to move to, though, and I think it's incredibly important to nuance this for us, which is that an issue that happened in Arab American feminist organizing and activism is around in the early 2000s. A lot of us got to the point of saying, we have been forced to react and respond to racism and war, because it's been so horrific, right? And there's this urgency because our people are dying back home, and this sense of blood and life and death, these questions. But as a result, our feminist activism covered up issues of gender violence and homophobia within our families and our communities. And so one of the issues that came up is that we started saying we want to do more than a reactive anti-imperialist feminism. We want to take up what's happening in our families and communities around gender and sexuality, but we don't want to do it in a way where we're reinforcing Orientalism. Because once you start saying that, say, there are these trends of domestic violence in Arab immigrant families, a lot of us feared becoming accomplices to anti-Arab racism, because we know that there are so many forces out there that would love to hear about how horrible Arab men are to justify, war abroad or Zionism. And so we had to be really careful and develop nuanced ways of addressing sexism and homophobia in our families, but also, internal politics that are not easy to talk about. Syria, Yemen, authoritarian dictatorships. And so I use this frame in the talk today, decolonizing culture, to capture that trend of that struggle among our feminist movements to actually develop politicized ways of addressing culture and family and internal politics. So that's where we said anti-imperialist feminism is not enough if it's reactionary and reinforces a hierarchy of struggles. Like, okay, you could talk about anti-Zionism, but you can't talk about sexism in the family. And definitely cut me off because I'm not keeping track of time. I'll just go quickly and say that, this is artwork that I used in my book, Arab America, to address the decolonizing culture from someone who was an activist back in the day, Lina Barudi, who addressed what it felt like to grow up in this reactionary setting where there's these ideas of what Arab culture is and these ideas of what American culture is, where Arab culture is seen as good girls who, marry who their parents want to marry, and American girls are seen as bad girls, and how all this was created as a reaction to the process of immigration to the United States. And these are the kinds of issues that we wanted to address because they were harming our youth and harming our people. So this goes back to the 1990s, the Arab Women's Solidarity Association in San Francisco, where we made this artwork to insist on like a feminist politics. And then I'll just go to a few more images from the Amwej conference, 2006, was the conference that I would argue consolidated the commitment to a decolonizing internal concepts of culture and Arab identity, where we organized a conference that was only for people from the Arab region to talk about what's happening in our communities and to create a language for that. And I'll just wrap it up by talking about the third trend, coalitional anti-imperialist feminisms. And these are not linear, they overlap. This is a trend where we realized as well, again, to challenge this idea of like hierarchy of struggles, because sometimes we feel so targeted, so invisible, so misunderstood that, it's like Arab feminists are the most invisible of the invisibles, right? And so we want to also challenge ourselves to not fall into a hierarchy of oppression or oppression Olympics. And so this trend, I think, is really important because it basically affirms that, especially since, I'll just say, especially maybe we could say, this idea is around the idea that the war on terror legitimized, for example, the militarization of the police. And so that's, therefore, if we really want to free more and more people, we need to be working in joint struggle with the struggle against policing and prisons, the struggle against borders, and the struggle for decolonizing US lands, native lands in the United States region. So this is just an image of this SWAT team showing up to Oakland, California to, to displace Black homeless mothers, houseless mothers from where they were living, using tanks. And so this is just, to me, really captures that our struggles are intertwined. The war on terror is sharing technologies with the police, sharing surveillance databases. And it's not just about solidarity where we connect our struggles with each other because we're in solidarity, or we have empathy, or we see that our struggles are similar, but that our struggles are intertwined. We cannot end the war on terror without ending policing, and we cannot end policing and prisons without ending the war on terror. They're sharing technologies, and they're also moving resources out of our schools, our neighborhoods, and putting them into the war on terror. Military recruitment is another area that our struggles are linked. Who is being recruited to the war on terror? It's, brown and Black youth who are putting their lives on the line as fodder for this war. And all of these issues are gendered and sexualized. We don't have to remind each other of the rates of sexualized violence in the US military. And so an Arab American feminist critique says that feminist politics is not about fighting for the inclusion of women and queers in the US military. It's about dismantling the US military altogether. So I'll end there and appreciate the time. And I'm so looking forward to hearing from my comrades on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadine, for this powerful introduction to the many themes that we're going to be talking about today. A really excellent survey of the different issues that affect Arab American women's movements and the themes that they have been focusing on, at least in the past 30 years. Now, we are particularly honored to be hosting Mary Harb, who was really one of the founders and pioneers in building Arab American women's movements and feminist work in the United States. She is a registered nurse, an activist, and a longtime champion of women's rights. Mary was a principal founder of the Palestinian American Women's Association of Southern California, PAWA. For those who are, by the way, active in initiatives relating to Arab American communities and women's movements, they would know that this is a very important association that has been a strong space of movement and inclusion for a long time. So Mary really is quite a legend in the Arab American community. She is still an active member of the board in Southern California of PAWA, the PAWA board, and she has been helping families with both locally and abroad in Palestine most of her life. She is well known throughout Southern California for her tireless activism and grassroots organizing skills. She has visited Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. And in 2009, she traveled to Gaza to break the US-backed Israeli siege. Her extraordinary passion for justice has inspired generations of young Palestinian women activists in the United States and abroad. I should end by noting that Mary, generally speaking, does not like to do self-promotion. She does not like to talk in these big events. She made an exception for us. So I'm especially honored that she agreed to speak on this panel. Mary, the floor is yours.
Shukran. Good afternoon. I would like to wish our Muslim brothers and sisters Ramadan Kareem and upcoming Eid with justice and peace for all. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this important panel, Arab American Women, Voices from Grassroots. A special thanks for Dr. Abdelrazak Takriti and staff from the Arab American Education Center at the University of Houston. I am honored to speak on behalf of our grassroots experiences. Someone asked me why I spend so much time working and volunteering in the community. The answer is simple. It is because who I am. They used to tell me, ليه بتوجعي راسك؟ اتركي واهتمي بحالك. But this is, I told them, it is who I am. I am a Palestinian woman who has witnessed the occupation, war, and oppression of my people. For these reasons, I feel that it is my moral duty to be involved with my community, especially by helping those most affected by the occupation of Palestine. My commitment and spirit are stand up to injustice and work for the empowerment of our community, especially for women and children. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a registered nurse, RN. I grew up in a patriotic home. Originally, my family is from Ramallah, Harb, Ramallah. My late father was a priest, an Orthodox priest. After the Nakba, my father graduated from the theology school in Egypt and was appointed a priest in Haifa, occupied Haifa by the Archdiocese of Jerusalem. He always instilled in us to be proud of our Palestinian identity, history, and culture. Then in the late 60s, he immigrated to USA. Then we followed him to US, and we ended up living in San Diego, California. In 1984, we established the first Palestinian American Women's Association, PAWA. This was after the 1982 Israeli invasion and siege of Beirut at the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. Once again, our Palestinian communities were uprooted from the land and now from the refugee camps. This impacted all of us. We would witness the war against our people on the nightly news. We had a large number of community members in LA who were refugees from 1948 and 1967. And in addition, Palestinian immigrants from various areas of the region. We want to do something so that our voices would be heard, so that we could support our communities in refugee camps and others. We believe it was important for women to have a voice and role in transformation and change. When we started our association, its mission was to empower Palestinian women to be productive and contributing members of society by fostering personal and social growth for Palestinian and Arab American women through helping them developing self-esteem, self-confidence, and leadership skill. But most importantly, we wanted to build connections and bridges with our communities back home. We must stay connected to one another, to stay connected to Palestine. We noticed there was a gap between the parents and the children. So we opened a youth center in LA to bridge this gap by teaching the children about the Palestinian history, culture, and tradition. In April 1986, PAWA was invited to join a national convention held in Chicago of Palestinian Women Associations, a national organization working with the communities on a grassroots level to empower women and support Palestinian people locally and in the homeland. We carried out many activities. There was focus on education, our women to understand the connection between the national and social oppression. We had yearly conferences. Women from other national and social movements joined in our conferences and shared their experiences. we felt strength and solidarity between the women. The solidarity between our communities and supporters was powerful. After the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, the UPWA national office was closed. Some of the local chapters continued to carry out the activities. Despite this, PAWA continued its community outreach, even though many people felt despair. We continue to work with women in our Southern California communities. Today, PAWA remains grounded in our community, focusing our work in Orange County area by providing women with a sense of purpose and genuine transformation. Some of PAWA's programs and activities include providing scholarship to unprivileged female students in Palestine at various Palestinian universities. We have now about 15 students. We start from, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, undergraduate. Second thing, supporting Palestinian farmers through our olive oil project. We buy the olive oil from Palestinian farmers to help sustain their livelihood and resell it locally. Preserving our Palestinian traditions, such as teaching our children traditional cultural dances and songs, and we formed Dabke dancing group. Our culture is our history. We take pride in promoting our culture by reviving the Palestinian embroideries made by women in the refugee camps. We bring the tatris min Gaza. Holding educational workshops and seminars for new refugees, including discussing what is considered child abuse and domestic abuse in the US, and informing families what they should do if they become involved with child protective services or accused of domestic abuse. PAWA established the Racial Khoury Scholarship Program to commemorate the life and honor the legacy of American peace activist Rachel Khoury. The scholarship program, which will act as a tool for broadening the scope of campus activities in Palestine to local students in the United States. The selected recipient of the Rachel Khoury Scholarship will be enrolled in Birzeit University's International Summer Camp Program, which was to achieve Birzeit University mission, build generation that provide an opportunity for cultural exchange, introduce the Palestinian cause, and that reinforce the Palestinian core values of care and respect and peace. Our annual events, include International Women's Day, Ramadan, and picnic. At the beginning of this year, we started Hike group, Hike for Palestine. It is so popular, we're attracting many high school and university school. Each week we go hiking, and we have about 30, 40 people join us. And the women loves it because it reminds them of Jamal Carmel, Palestine, and they start to pick khubbeze and other things, from this hiking. And I believe in keeping our community connected through our social relation and political events is a way to keep our community healthy and provide a safety net for our elders and youth. I believe continuing to support the grassroots efforts is vital to building our communities, to lead with a vision for justice and build our democratic civic organizations. We need to build a bridge between the grassroots, the academics, and the business community to work hard to mentor the younger generation so the young people can step in and take over the leadership as we work for justice and peace to end oppression in Palestine, Arab world, and everywhere. The future of power are young generation, American women. I have seen in hand that they are motivated with innovative ideas and energy to build a free Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for all the incredible work you've been doing for all these years. You're a true pioneer and a genuine grassroots leader, and we're honored that you were able to join us. If you all haven't noticed, I'm a total groupie, so what can we do? But lots of love to you and to all the great people that are building the Palestinian women's movement and the Arab women's movement in Southern California and elsewhere. So we'll hear from Jehan Hakim. And of course, Jehan is from a different generation than that of Mary, but it's a generation that has also produced very important work and has led some significant campaigns on the grassroots level. Jehan also comes from the West Coast, but she's from the Bay Area. She chairs the Yemeni Alliance Committee, which was formed after J20 to support Yemeni American communities in the Bay Area and beyond during periods of social unrest. YAC organizes protests and actions, coordinates congressional visits, creates social media toolkits and campaigns to resist anti-Yemeni policies. Its focus recently has been to advocate towards the end of the U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen by raising awareness and pushing legislation, in addition to fighting to repeal the ban. Now, the founders of YAC also happen to be from Yemen and are directly impacted by these issues. The work that Jehan has been doing goes back earlier. She was previously an NSCR community advocate for advancing justice Asian Law Caucus. She sits on the board of Just Foreign Policy. She's a mother and a San Francisco native. It's an honor to host you, Jehan, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. Happy Arab Heritage Month and Ramadan Mubarak to those observing. Thank you to the University of Houston and to AAEF Center for Arab Studies. I'm so humbled to share space with the other esteemed Arab women speaking today. Some I even call friends. I don't have a presentation, but I'll be ranting about the brief history of the Yemeni women's movement, my organizing journey into that movement in the United States, as well as my experience as the chair and founder of the Yemeni Alliance Committee, and a little bit around kind of Yemeni solidarity and this anti-war movement that we're a part of. So I think the Yemeni women's movement began in Yemen in a public way in 2011. If folks remember the Arab Spring, you might have heard of Tawakkul Kirman, who was called the mother of the revolution by some Yemenis. I say it goes back even further to Al-Malika Bilqis, the Queen Bilqis, the Queen of Saba, who ruled in the 10th century BC, or even to Queen Asma or Arwa, who led Yemen much later. Yemeni women in leadership positions are not a new phenomenon. But for those of us in the United States, like many other Arab and Muslim women, have been active for Palestine, for example, for decades. I remember attending protests with my mom in the streets of San Francisco as a young girl. I think being pro-Palestine has always meant pro-Arab, pro-freedom, and it's something that I knew was a cause that I was obligated to stand for as an Arab and a Muslim. Even when I went to Yemen, Yemeni children would chant to songs that were all about Palestine, freedom, resistance, and down with the occupation and Zionism. Just imagine, Yemeni children as young as 5 singing in Arabic solidarity songs about Palestine. So Palestine has been in our hearts ever since I was a little kid. And this is the same for almost all Yemenis and Arabs as a whole. I visited Yemen regularly and lived there as a teenager, and I could see a clear distinction between what the US looked like and how Yemen appeared to me. one appearing advanced, while the other seemingly in a state of perpetual poverty in comparison. I learned earlier on that the Arab world for far too long have been victims of oppression, colonialism, global imperialism that were caused by the overreach of Western powers, especially after the discovery of oil in the Gulf and in other countries. Many Arab countries were and still are considered third world or undeveloped, with the exception of the Gulf and some other areas. And this is not because there's something inherently weak or unintelligent about our people or our culture. The West often is using religion as a cause for our regression. But in reality, Arab countries seem stagnant economically because Western powers have grabbed our lands, our resources, and for decades have had some role in our political establishments, always wanting to have some control. So I think the catalyst for how I got involved in politics or advocacy generally was the aftermath of 9/11. And at the time, as a visibly Muslim woman, instantly my identity became politicized. And my appearance became a target, especially because of my hijab. So I have had, my share of Islamophobic stories, like so many other Muslims and Arabs, and those perceived as Muslim or Arabs living in the US and even across the world, who were bullied, attacked, and some have even been killed by racist Islamophobes. I learned that the war on terror was born after that tragic attack, and what that meant for Yemenis and other young Muslim men and from other countries. That means that they were shipped to Guantanamo Bay, the torture camp, many held indefinitely. For example, Yemeni national, we're hearing about him on the news right now, Hassan bin Attash, who was 16 when he was kidnapped by the US and tortured in 2002. He was hung by his wrists and a lot of war crimes were committed against him. So many other of the other Arab and Muslim young men. And now we're hearing that Hassan is being considered for release 20 years later. This is the war on terror. I also learned that unmanned drone strikes were targeting Yemenis, some even striking children and innocent civilians. And these strikes continue until today due to the AUMF, the authorization to use military force that became law after 9/11. The list of horrific policies that impacted Muslim and Arab countries are long, and many are still in effect till today, as Sister Nadine mentioned. So if you're Arab or Muslim, most of us are political. We have no choice. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, used to say fighting is in our blood, because it also means survival and the pathway towards self-determination, which is a human right? I think we can all agree that everyone is owed that. So hopefully I've painted an idea of what it looks like to be Arab and Muslim, which provides context to why I started the Yemeni Alliance Committee and how it came to be that Yemeni women are leading this movement globally. I've worked in the Arab and Muslim community of the Bay Area here in California and even nationally for some time now on immigration policies, racial profiling, an array of issues. So when the civil war in Yemen started in 2014, Yemenis poured into the streets of Yemen. And Yemeni women led demonstrations in the capital of Sana'a. They were an integral part of organizing. And I take my inspiration from them. Additionally, here in the US, Yemeni men and women also poured into the streets, standing in solidarity with their people back home. But things changed in 2015 because what was once a civil war amongst the Yemenis turned into a regional inferno, making foreign intervention a new reality for the almost 30 million people that lived in Yemen. And since 2015 until today, the war on Yemen has been one that not only the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which is the coalition, they're often referred to as the coalition, are responsible for bombing and starving Yemenis, but it's also one that the US is actively involved in, has been backing and arming, and is also profiting from. Again, Yemeni men and women took to the streets to protest this mass violence on our people, and now this mass violence being sponsored by the US. But you know what? Things changed because not that many people joined these protests, not allies either. There was a shift in sentiment. A lot of Yemenis were confused. Questions like, why is the US helping Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates bomb Yemen? How do we as Muslims and Arabs push back against the aggression of two powerful Arab and Muslim countries? And should we? I knew a lot of people after being on the front line during the Trump administration. We attended rallies together. We shut down airports as a collective, did intakes for folks that were impacted by the Muslim ban, and have stood up for other communities that were impacted by illegal policies that the US government was responsible for. We oftentimes hear if the US doesn't want refugees, then why are they creating them? That's real. Our US policies do create refugees. I got silence from comrades, not all, of course. Of course, this movement is global, and we have a lot of friends. But there's been a lot of silence, a lot of loneliness. Some of my fellow Yemenis and I would tag team with other organizations, holding small rallies under Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House office, or led marches down the busy streets of San Francisco. But whatever we did not make a dent in the media. And more importantly, Yemeni Americans were not organizing with us. It was disappointing and frustrating. And I think out of that despair, the Yemeni Alliance Committee was born. I founded the Yemeni Alliance Committee with my comrade Hussam Fallah in 2017. And since then, the Yemeni Alliance Committee has been working to push foreign policy away from militarism and this illegal war on Yemen. It started really, really small and tiny. I started a Facebook page to raise awareness, pushing back against how the media portrays this issue as a civil war. Hopefully you understand now, if you thought it was a civil war, it is definitely not a civil war. As if the bombs that drop on Yemenis by companies such as Lockheed Martin or Raytheon were not made in the US. I then entered the Twitter space, and that was mind-blowing. And that's where I met all types of advocates, made friends from all around the world, and some enemies. Although I've been trolled by many bots and warmongers, it is on Twitter that I met some amazing Yemeni American women and Yemeni women in the diaspora and inside of Yemen. I've connected with women doing amazing service on the ground in Yemen, and I met my sisters in this work too. So 4 Yemeni American women who I talk to regularly, we organize together and we hold space for each other. So I want to give a shout out to Dr. Shireen Al-Adimi from Michigan, Dr. Aisha Jum'an from Seattle, Suwaya Al-Rumain from New York, and Kauthar Abdullah, who's also from New York, who heads our Yemeni Alliance Committee chapter in New York. So all 5 of us have faced smear campaigns that are global. They're in English and in Arabic. I don't know of any other language so far. Like I said, we've been trolled and shamed for our positions, at time imposing false narratives on our anti-imperial position, painting us as one-sided. But the truth is we are nonpartisan. And unfortunately, I think this is, it's easier to do this to women, Arab women especially, than it is to men. Policy and organizing has historically been dominated by men, so it's not a surprise. It's just one of those things, even with all the hate, these 5 Yemeni American women have been consistent and persistent, and I'm proud of our passion and dedication. I must also add that we have other full-time jobs that are unrelated to politics. So this is our volunteer work. This is the work that is our, it comes from the heart. Foreign policy is hard, and not many people, much less Yemeni American men or women, are in these spaces. So I so appreciate my Yemeni sisters. We keep each other going. Since we've been together, the anti-Yemen war movement has grown. It is definitely international. We collaborate with folks in Ireland, Italy, the UK, and other places. This movement is unique because Yemeni women voices are at the center. We lead, and our allies follow and support, which is much different from a lot of other advocacy spaces I've been in. We're passionate about this cause. Our families are in Yemen, and we thoroughly understand what we're up against, right? This empire, and it doesn't want to fall, much less not fall to the hands of Yemeni women. which is partly why it's been such a challenge to move the needle on arms sales and war support to the coalition and its aggression on Yemen. The movement continues to grow, and we hope to see some changes soon, inshallah. Representatives Jaya Paul and DeFazio, for example, have publicly stated that they plan to introduce a Yemen War Powers Resolution that will end the role of the U.S. in its sale of arms to the coalition that's been bombing Yemen for 7 years and has killed hundreds of thousands of Yemenis, and also ending the U.S. naval support of the blockade, which has starved millions of Yemenis. So I'll end here, but I encourage folks to plug into this advocacy work and be part of the anti-war movement. Our tax dollars are at work in Yemen and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jehan. And it was very important for us and our audience to hear from you, especially because you're working at the intersection between the women's movement and the anti-war movement in Yemen and the anti-imperialist movement in our region as a whole. I think one of the recent horrors of watching the news today, it's been really terrible for me to keep on listening voices of solidarity with people in the Ukraine that ignore other people that are subject to conflict and bombing. It doesn't mean that any population should be bombed in Ukraine or elsewhere, but in a place like Yemen, where the U.S. plays such a central role, and where the administration could literally just tell its allies to stop. This onslaught has already killed hundreds of thousands of people. It's still going on. So it is very inspiring to see 5 Yemeni American women leading this movement here in this country and playing such a central role in it. I know there are many others that participate in it, but you all play a central and important role in that. So it's I think we want to hear more and more from you in the future, and we're honored to have heard from you today. Hopefully in the questions period, we'll get further engagement. Now we move on to another great organizer who's operating in a different sphere, in a more academic environment as well, but also connected to communities, which is Dr. Zeina Zaatari. She is the director of the Arab American Cultural Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and is also an adjunct faculty there at the Department of Anthropology and a faculty fellow in the UIC Honors College. For over 20 years, Zeina Zaatari, who is a feminist from South Lebanon, has worked on gender and racial justice in Arab and Arab American communities, both within the academic and nonprofit spaces. She's been doing programming and producing knowledge in these spaces in important ways. Her most recent publications include a co-edited book with Saad Joseph and Lina Meari titled The Politics of Engaged Gender Research in the Arab Region, Feminist Fieldwork and Knowledge Production, which was published by IB Taurus this year. So that might be good Christmas reading. You should all check it out. And she is currently co-editing with Saad Joseph the Handbook of Women in the Middle East, which is due to be released later this year by Routledge. So Zeina also has a history before joining UIC in 2019. She worked as a research director of Political Research Associates, an organization that studies the U.S. right. So she was doing important work in dealing with rising right-wing and fascist currents in this country. She's also taught courses in anthropology and gender and sexuality at several universities and worked as the regional director for the MENA program at the Global Fund for Women, where she managed a diverse grant-making program to support women's and trans movements in the Middle East and North Africa. So we're very honored to host you, Dr. Zaatari, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Takriti. Thank you so much. Just want to start by thanking all the organizers and the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies for inviting me to speak at this event. It's also really great to be in the company of so many women I deeply respect and have learned from over the years. So I was asked to speak on gender, racial, and sexual justice amongst Arab American communities, drawing particularly on my own experiences. While my academic research has focused primarily on the Arab region proper and on gender and sexuality, especially in the past years on feminist and queer movements in the Arab region and queer subjectivity in Lebanon, I've been primarily, obviously, living and working in the US. As is the case often, the lines between the homeland and the diaspora, as we just heard over and over, is and should be blurred. Many of us living here are deeply involved with movements in the region. I co-founded and currently serve on the board of the Women Human Rights Defenders Middle East and North Africa Coalition, which is a network of organizations and individual activists addressing the challenges that women human rights defenders that are working on a range of issues from colonization, climate justice, democracy, labor, sexuality to women's rights across the region, and providing support and capacity building in addition to documentation of the violations that defenders face. As someone who came here as a graduate student in the early 90s, my engagement with the feminist and queer movements in the region has been a constant through research, knowledge production, accompaniment, and as well during my time working at the Global Fund for Women, as mentioned just previously, in ensuring resources reach groups across the region fighting for justice and equality. At the same time, I couldn't but be involved locally in my own Arab American community, and particularly the feminist and queer community and Palestine solidarity work. I am but one example of many of us, as you just heard. Activists there, also in the region, are also not only impacted by the US imperial project and the war on terror, global economic policies, etc., but are also often connected to activists here, engaging in a number of issues and building solidarity movements. As Nadine explained, this has a long history and is true for all kinds of social movements, anti-war, Palestine, food sovereignty, political prisoners, and it is true for the gender and sexuality movements as well. The challenges that we face are multiple, and I can still see so many similarities even over the years. On some level, the issues are still the same. Activists, women, trans, and non-binary folks are still having to navigate problematic masculinity, including male leadership, not only in the larger society and within our communities, but also inside our organizing spaces, as Nadine mentioned, and as some of her published work also speaks to. Some of these experiences continue today. Young women student leaders struggle with being taken seriously by some of the male students on campus, who may prefer to speak to other men, bypassing the person who is actually in a leadership position. Some find that their efforts undermined because they are women. Others feel they are being judged differently because of their gender and perspective, accused of being too liberal or too bossy. Other women who may be more visibly Muslim, as in wearing a hijab, also experience particular challenges connected to the stereotypes people have about Islam and women. And those stereotypes are not only from, the larger mainstream society, but also from within. So women they may be assumed to be too submissive or oppressed and thus cannot speak for themselves. Women are targeted in specific ways that pertain to their gender, with threats of being raped or slut-shamed. These experiences connect with the ways women human rights defenders in the region report the kinds of attacks they have experienced, whether it's in cyberspace, and Jehan alluded to some of these attacks, activists in Yemen that we've worked with over the years, as well as more recently in Sudan, have been targeted in many ways, including in cyberspace, and also in real life and harassment they experience in detentions or in prisons. Another important area is the challenge of addressing racial, sexual, and gender oppressions within our own communities while our communities are under attack or threat. Feminist and queer activists in the region are accused of being westernized or agents of empire for speaking up about patriarchy or homophobia or transphobia. These accusations come from all sorts of spaces. So from, religious-based groups or leaders, political parties, leftist leadership, government officials, and Arab academics in Western institutions, among others. they find themselves needing to navigate organizing spaces around these accusations, which aim to dismiss and discredit, and oftentimes can lead to direct violence and arrest of activists. While nationalist movements did open up space for women's activism or engagement in the public sphere at the tail end of the colonial era across the region, they often foreclosed those possibilities soon after. This is why many have argued that leftist movements have co-opted and opportunistically used women without fully incorporating their agendas, or often saying, everyone will be free when we are eventually liberated, or let's postpone discussing on these issues, or this is not the priority right now. Similarly, for feminist activists here, many of us, I would say, were primarily engaged on larger political issues, as you just heard. Palestine, the war in Lebanon, Iraq, more recently Syria, Yemen, and other locations. Many were and still are hesitant to speak up about other important issues impacting our communities here, from within and without, for fear of making our men look bad or being labeled Islamophobic or too Americanized. This is not just our experience, though. Feminists of color historically in the US have been also called traitors to their race for bringing up domestic violence or speaking about toxic masculinity. Activists of color articulated intersectionality even before that word, came to be, all the way from the Combahee River Collective and the Third World Women's Alliance. They saw intersectionality as an important framework that has resonated with Arab and Arab American feminists and queer activists. Intersectionality is not necessarily about identity, as is often described, but rather about intersecting systems of oppression that produce specific experiences for people that generate new lived realities. I want to give a few examples from my own experiences. So I recall a day in 1996 when I was a graduate student at Iowa State University. This was my second year in the US. After the demise of the General Union of Palestinian Students, few of us on campus created an Arab student organization. It was election night, and running for president and vice president were two Arab women. I had just a few weeks earlier been sitting at a panel organized by the Women's Resource Center on campus. The panel was on women and Islam. And I had a few other Muslim students joining me on the panel. I was approaching this as an academic and researcher, since this is partly my area of work. And so sharing diversity of perspective and issues and not necessarily claiming a Muslim identity. Someone in the audience asked, how come the other two women were wearing a hijab and I was not? So I replied explaining that it is a matter of choice and that there are schools of thought who do not believe that the hijab is required for women in Islam. I explained a few of the verses in the Quran, how these scholars had interpreted them, and once again emphasizing that women choose to wear or not to wear. As news traveled that there are two women running, one of whom was me, our small group of students who had been active for the past year and a half on campus, organizing events, protests, cultural fairs, etc., were suddenly bombarded by large numbers of male students coming in to now join the organization and want to vote. They did not want the two women to lead. Debates continued until the wee hour of the night without a resolution. These men came to protect their faith in some way from someone they perceived to be a threat. In their minds, though the word was not yet common, I was probably seen as Islamophobic. A couple of years ago, we were showing a film on Arab feminism during a film festival we organized here at the center. The documentary, like most, had some challenges. Obviously, it was filmed from a particular vantage point, while also claiming to speak about the full, perspective of the Arab feminist movement, which is an impossible task to do in 45 minutes. Discussions of the way in which women's bodies become subjects of public debate and how particularly the hijab was politicized, used by the West and nationalist government as a symbol of backwardness, as we saw calls to remove the veil by the colonial entities, as well as sometimes national leadership that came to power after independence. And then on the one hand, and then on the other hand, also by the growing political Islamist groups in years later who saw it as a symbol of virtue and cultural authenticity. So the film was discussing these issues, not always very well, but it was bringing some of this stuff up. Nonetheless, some of the students were very upset that the Arab American Cultural Center would show such a film. Rather than seeing this as an opportunity to discuss the issues, understand the historical context of the issue in the region, and yes, present critiques of the film, they were agitated as they once again felt that this presents an image of Islam that is in adherence to the West's demonization of Islam and is thus Islamophobic, and that was not our role. And obviously, there are some deep-rooted and justified reasons for this sense of fear and worry within the Arab American community about how we speak about our region, our men, and our religion, as Orientalist tropes are strong and have had immense repercussions on our lives, as Nadine initially started articulating in her presentation. The repercussions including constant surveillance, to demonic representations on television screens and social media, to numerous legislation that targets our community, to billions of dollars supporting Islamophobic groups across the country. These are kind of like two examples that kind of present in my mind the challenges and the difficulties of being able to bring up and address these issues in the context of the US. In the summer of protest and after the murders of George Floyd and other Black folks that year, we witnessed a discernible interest in addressing anti-Black racism within our communities. Activists who had been speaking up about these issues for years found a welcoming space to speak up and engage, connecting between racism in the US and racism in our homeland. There was a definite desire among students to figure out how to create change on this issue and how to engage with their families and their communities. And of course, we jumped on the opportunity to engage with them on these issues and help them find tools and language. However, there were also voices who wanted to claim that this was also an imported issue, as in, this is the experience here in America. We didn't use these language. We aren't like that in the region. Or who wanted to blame it all on colonialism. Colonialism brought racism to our worlds. This was also an attempt, in my mind, to protect a supposed authenticity of a time and a place where these problems did not plague our society. Perhaps it is understandable that communities under attack seek to hold on to this kind of an imaginary narrative about our past and our present. However, figuring out how to work on the multiplicity of our issues and our intersectional lives is key. This challenge is very real. All of our liberations are tied together. It is important to keep struggling to carve out a third way where we can be proud of our cultural heritage and identities, while simultaneously being critical of our past and our present, and work to dismantle our various cultural dictates that contribute to the strengthening of these intersectional systems of oppression, patriarchy, white supremacy, racism, ableism, classism, and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaatari. I truly loved your presentation, especially because it touched upon a range of themes that we are often shy about discussing, for the reasons that you just mentioned. Just because there is a colonial assault on our communities, just because we're subject to racism, just because we are subject to Islamophobia and other forms of hate, does not mean that we don't exhibit the same problems that affect societies across the world. Sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, and also very conservative readings of religion. And I think that what you're talking about is charting a new pathway that takes into account seriously these contradictions within our communities, while also not budging an inch on protecting these communities from assaults that weaponize these internal contradictions, not towards emancipatory ends, but towards furthering systems of domination. So it's an honor to have listened to you, and I look forward to many questions to you and to our panelists. I'll start the round, and I'll start with Dr. Zaatari, actually. So, Dr. Zaatari, I think you've identified the problem, which is these contradictions are there. And you've identified, of course, the serious assaults that our communities are subjected to, following in the footsteps of our other panelists. But can you tell us a bit more about the grassroots work that you've been doing to provide solutions to that? Because I know that you've been very involved in creating spaces that tackle these issues, and maybe we'd benefit from hearing about some of these spaces. I know it's impossible for you to cover all of them, but maybe one or two examples.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think, there are like a lot of different spaces by which we're trying to engage. And I think the establishment of the Arab American Cultural Center here on campus, Nadine was the founding director who worked with all the students on campus to establish it back in 2016. And I think having such a space that is, at the same time, a place where students can feel, it's I don't want to call it totally a safe space. We prefer the usage of brave spaces, right? Where we can have these tough conversations about the issues that affect us, but where they also can somewhat relax, understanding that they're in a place that understands the complexities of their identities and the backgrounds that they're coming from, is I think crucial. So having spaces for young generations to be able to engage in some of these issues and open up is really important. And it builds on years of creating such spaces. As Nadine mentioned, Amwaj was a really important convening, and it was here in Chicago, actually. A lot of us came from different places to attend it, and it was a space where we could unpack and discuss a lot of these issues that are where we were finding really hard to speak up and sort of outside of our own spaces because in part of the attacks, but also because we thought we could be easily co-opted into agendas that we weren't invested or interested in, as the war on terror has co-opted some of the feminist movement's agenda in the US, importing it outside. And so, I mean, we create simply like conversation spaces here for folks to be able to speak about these issues. The center had established a set of points of unity that speak about the challenges that we face as a community within and outside. And so we draw on these values to engage in conversations and create programming that helps to address those kinds of issues. And we're constantly trying to innovate possible ways to connect with the students. We're working for a student leadership institute this summer, where the hope is that we would support students in building organizing skills, understanding terminologies, figuring out how do these values sort of translate into action. I mean, we all talk about progressive values or justice, social justice or equality, but what does it mean and what does it really look like? What is the world that we want, and how can we engage with people that are very different from us, or working on issues of solidarity as well. So I don't know if these are like just few broad examples about some of the things we've been doing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaatari. We have a couple of questions. One is actually from Professor Naber to Mary about thoughts on doing more intergenerational work and activism. And do you have examples or suggestions on how to grow our relationship across generations of women activists? And Jehan is also seconding the request for your thoughts on this, Mary. We know that you've been doing a lot of intergenerational work and you have some thoughts on it. So please share with us.
We are focusing on our youth. last October, we have the election. We let about 4 or 5 people member to be on our board. Last International Women's Day, we have the student from UC Riverside, UC Irvine, and other university to participate on International Women's Day on stage. And we try to have activities together with PYM and other youth, organization. We try our best. The social media is done by the youth, our social media. So we're trying our best to focus on our youth.
That's wonderful. We have also a question from Professor Sue Ferguson, who, by the way, happens to be a leading feminist author in her own right and a major social reproduction theory innovator. She says, this is a wonderful panel, thank you. I wonder if any of the panelists could elaborate on the following. How can addressing sexism and queerphobia within communities potentially strengthen the movement against imperialism? In other words, it's not just that anti-imperialists should be feminists, but that the success of anti-imperialism depends upon eliminating sexism and queer phobia. Do we have any thoughts on this? Maybe Nadine, you have some ideas around this, or if any other panelists would like to comment, please go ahead.
Yeah. Do any of the other panelists want to? I have thoughts. I'm happy to share.
Maybe several people could share thoughts on this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to be brief so other people can have a chance. Well, yeah, I fully agree, and I'm assuming all the panelists would agree. And I think the way I would respond would be that I think there's 2 ways to practice queer politics. One would be, and we need both. One is accountability and solidarity. Like for me, as someone who, is in a heterosexual marriage and doesn't face the challenges that the targeting that my queer comrades or trans comrades might face. So it would be coming from that perspective, I would say. Accountability and solidarity with queer and trans folks, but also commitment and accountability to a queer politics, which is like a queer political consciousness and analysis of what you said, Professor Ferguson, which is how US empire and Zionism rely on homophobia and in the process of targeting our people, so that committing to queer politics is both about accountability to queer and trans folks and about insisting that a queer analysis is necessary if we are going to be anti-racist and anti-imperialist. And the examples would be how, Zionism uses arguments about gay rights to justify colonization, recruiting gay Palestinians as part of the colonial project. And then but not just saying that or committing to challenging that, because then you're almost just doing it for the sake of, ending imperialism, but not simultaneously taking seriously how the way that sexuality is used in colonialism and imperialism further marginalizes queer and trans people in our communities, but also in the United States, especially people of color. So like when the United States, with the Abu Ghraib torture case, putting Iraqi men in gay sex positions and equating, gay sex with dehumanization, that didn't only affect, or wasn't only part of the US war in Iraq to use racist ideas about Muslim homophobia to cover up US imperial violence, but also that disproportionately trickles down into reinforcing homophobia, especially against queer people of color, and violence and torture against queer people of color in the United States more broadly.
I mean, I like what you said in terms of, how the success of anti-imperialism depends on eliminating sexism and queerphobia among other forms. I mean, for me, that's the piece around how all of these issues are intimately and integrally intertwined and interconnected. That, I think what we've seen, at least if I were to do like a big sweep of like sort of anti-imperialist politics globally and in the region, is that they have often failed in many instances, in part because I think they're continuously leaving communities out or refusing to be actually, taking public positions or speaking up about some of the significant, violations and atrocities that are taking place, right? Because at its foundation, imperialism is heteropatriarchy, is white supremacy, is transphobic, etc. Those aren't things outside of the imperial project. So then, how can we, dismantle this empire without dismantling all the different parts of it? Like, that would be an impossible adventure, which is, I think, where we have been. In large parts, so I feel like, people, and that cross cuts to other issues, people who claim, support for dictatorships in the region under the guise of anti-imperialism, leave out, right, major communities and populations under the boots because they are not willing to. They're making strategic decisions that aren't rooted in really understanding how imperialism actually works.
Well, on that note, I'd like to really, really thank our panelists for an incredible session. I learned a lot from it, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I know our audience did because I got lots of private messages thanking the Center for hosting these incredible voices. And I'd also like to thank Fadi Qafaiti, who is really the secret soldier in this operation. He makes sure that everything is running smoothly. And I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the UH Staff Council. It's really a big deal that we have a university that is committed to creating spaces like this in a US context where not enough spaces are being created for Arab American communities that face severe forms of racialization and racist attacks. And so I'm very glad that we were able to host this event. Thank you so much, Dr. Zaatari. Thank you, Dr. Naber. And thank you, Mary, our wonderful pioneering grassroots activist. And also, of course, Jehan, who had to leave us, unfortunately, due to another commitment. She had to leave just right now. Our thanks go to her and to the incredible work she's doing in combating this horrific assault on our people in Yemen. So congratulations to all our speakers for wonderful talks, and I look forward to seeing you all in future events. I would